Hi, I'm Doris Kearns Goodwin, a presidential historian and author of Leadership in Turbulent Times, and you are watching Author's Voice.
Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and our show today is A House Divided. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, there's a comments button below the screen, and if you want to press that, you can ask a question while we are live and online, and give us your name and where you're from, so at least shout out and say hello. If you want to order a book, you can do that right now. Just go to the button for that and order one, and we'll make sure we get one signed for you. And if you're watching on YouTube after the live broadcast, we'll most likely still have books for you to sign, first editions signed, while they last. Well, I'm going to get right to this because I'm so happy to have Doris Kearns Goodwin, a friend of ours for a long time, be with us. A person who really doesn't need any introduction, right? A historian, an author, congrats on the Red Sox.
Yeah, it was a pretty great summer, I must say.
Yeah, I bet, and I can't wait for the Sox to be washed out to white.
And then you'll be happy.
And then I'll be happy, exactly. And you're here for the third time in our shop, and I thank you. She's the author of Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream, No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, which won the Pulitzer, Team of Rivals, which won the prestigious Lincoln Prize and was the basis of Steven Spielberg's film on Lincoln, and The Bully Pulpit, which was on Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft and won the Carnegie Medal. Her latest book, the one she's here for today, is Leadership in Turbulent Times, in the nick of time, by the way, by Simon & Schuster, 473 pages, illustrated, and it's $30. And this is what the back of it looks like. And let's see, get over here so you can see it. And I should tell you that just like Gone with the Wind, this has two jackets, two states of a dust jacket. And this is the first, and while we still have them, you can get a first edition, first state. Gone with the Wind had a second state, a first state, where Gone with the Wind was down on the back of the list, and then all of a sudden they had a big thing on their hands, so it went up to #1, and they just switched out the jackets, and yours now says #1 or on the New York Times.
Bestseller, instant bestseller,
exactly,
something like that.
Yes. So congrats for
Thank
that
you.
as
and
well.
note that it's thinner than some of the other books. Even though you said 437 pages,
yeah,
it's about half the length of the others.
It reads faster than that. I don't want to go any further without giving condolences for Richard Goodwin, your husband, longtime husband, and he had a writing career, speech writing career with Kennedy, with LBJ, and elsewhere. And you've always said how you've woken up with all these men here, but at the end of the day, you had Richard to wake up with. And there was a story I just heard from Seymour Hersh in his autobiography, where he talks about one night in a hotel room, Hersh is there, and all of a sudden Richard is there knocking on the door and comes in and says, I want to work for Eugene McCarthy and write for him speeches. Well, he had left Robert Kennedy because, for the time,
He wasn't running yet.
He wasn't running yet, and because of the war. He just wasn't courageous enough. So he said to, Richard said, we are going to overthrow a president. And that's really what they did. So how is it to be married to an overthrower of presidents?
Well, you know, what makes me so proud of his long career right now is, #1, it was in public service most of the time. Even though he graduated first in his class at Harvard Law Review, clerking for Frankfurt, he could have gone to any law firm, but he wanted to be in public service. That was the feeling back then in the 50s and the 60s. And then words mattered. I mean, I think that given our current climate right now, the fact that the words that he wrote for Kennedy and Johnson, particularly on civil rights, had an impact, and they healed divisions. I mean, think about that "We Shall Overcome" speech, which I think is the proudest moment in public life. You know, there is no Negro problem. There is no no white problem, there is no Southern problem, there is no Northern problem, there's only an American problem, and we are here to fix that problem. And then he takes the anthem of the civil rights movement, and we shall overcome. And just thinking about those words lasting and how they can inspire, and they're part of our lexicon right now. Plus, I'm so proud of him that when he saw the war eating up the Great Society, he did leave and became an anti-war activist, and was told by some of the people, you know, Dick, you should have just kept quiet. You had a great career growing, but loyalty was to the country rather than loyalty to the president, for whom that was the height of his ambition and fulfillment, to be there in civil rights, Great Society, Howard University speech. But he felt something else had taken place of that. So by the end of his life, though, we talked about Johnson in much more empathetic terms. I had always felt empathetic, having known him, and he began to see how extraordinary Johnson's impact on our life was.
No,
Medicare, Medicaid, 3 great civil rights laws, Head Start, PBS. It's extraordinary.
Except for that, from that cartoon where you lift and you see
Well,
lifting
he had
up,
yeah,
and that scar
he had
of
a few
Vietnam.
little, yes, that's exactly
that
right.
was the real albatross.
And when I knew him in those last years, that's what we talked about, the sadness of knowing that his legacy had been cut in two.
Yeah.
But I think now just his ability to deal with Congress is in such difference from what we see today that he's understood more.
Yeah. So thank you for talking about Richard a moment. He's in
he
our
deserves-
hearts, and we appreciate
It was the adventure of
him.
a lifetime to be married, 42 years
bet.
to him.
Now, I felt it's great that historians are now regularly on newscasts and on cable and elsewhere. You and Beschloss and Meacham and Brinkley and others. I don't remember this as a child, seeing that sort of context being placed before us in the news. And with the humanities cut back in colleges and elsewhere, are newsrooms becoming our new classrooms?
Well, that's an interesting thought. I mean, what makes me so happy when I go on is not that I can be a pundit, because I don't want to be that, but always there's some event that takes place that has a context in the past. And if you can show the echo in the past and maybe get perspective or reassurance from it, I mean, especially right now, because people keep asking me, are these the worst of times? Because it feels pretty unmoored right now, our time. And just to be able to point out, look what it was like for Lincoln coming into office when, you know, the country is split in two, 600,000 people or more are going to die. And he said, if I'd ever known how bad it was going to be, I wasn't sure I could live through it. Or think about FDR coming in with the Depression at full tilt and banks collapsing, and people not knowing for sure that capitalism would exist. So just to be knowing that we went through these tough times before, we got through them, we had the right leaders in the right place, and the citizens were active during that time. It's a good lesson for us.
You know, there's a question I have down the road here, but I'm going to ask it right now, because I saw you on Bill Maher, and you were so optimistic for him. He was kind of dragging down, and you were just so optimistic. And I remembered that in 7th grade, I heard that if you're keeping your head while everyone around you is losing theirs, perhaps you don't understand the situation. So how do you keep up your optimism when we all understand the situation?
Well, I guess because what happened before, and as I say, these times were worse, is that leadership is a two-way street. So it's not just that we have to sit around hoping for a different leader. We have to become active, and that's what happened. Lincoln, when he was called the liberator, said, no, the anti-slavery movement, and the Union soldiers did it all. And then the progressive movement underlay both Teddy and Franklin Roosevelt. People were in the settlement houses. People were worrying about the social gospel before he even got into office. And then the civil rights movement, of course, precedes Lyndon Johnson. So I think it's just a matter of, FDR said, man make problems, man can solve problems. There are answers to our political system, which definitely needs almost a revolution. It's not just Mr. Trump in power. Something's wrong with our system right now. Yeah. But there are ways to change it. We have to believe that. And if you don't, what choice is there? Pessimism gets you nowhere.
No, that's very true. Very true. Let me get to the book for a moment here, since we're here for that too. How might we read the book? There are 3 main sections that you put it into: ambition and the recognition of leadership, adversity and growth, the leader and the times, how they led. So, and these topics are subdivided into essays on each president with textual comparisons to each as you go along, which is a great way. Now, one woman told me, she already read the book, and how she read it is that she started out with Lincoln and then skipped to the next chapter, Lincoln, the next chapter, Lincoln, and then went back for Teddy Roosevelt, and et cetera. So there may be other ways to read this book. Which manner would you like it? I mean, Dan would read it as I wrote it?
No, no, I think it's fine to read it that way. And I can see why when you get, the first part is when they're young, when they enter public office for the first time. And the reason I did that, I was at a college campus and a kid raised his hand and he said, how can I ever become one of them? I was talking about the Roosevelts in the White House. And he said, they're on Mount Rushmore, it's too far away. So I decided I wanted young people to be able to see them when they first run. They're 23, they're 28, and they're not going to be sure that they're going to win. And indeed, they're going to fail, and they're going to struggle, and they're going to be overconfident, and they're going to make mistakes so that you can aspire to be one of them. So that's the first part. And then the second part is, as you say, when they go through adversity, they all went through terrible adversity. And I think that sort of makes a person, if you get through it, wisdom and perspective. I mean, we know that Lincoln had a near suicidal depression. Teddy Roosevelt lost his wife and his mother on the same day in the same house and goes to the Badlands and then becomes a Western cowboy as well as an Eastern guy. Yeah. And of course, FDR had the polio, which transformed him. I mean, there was a sense in which he emerged much more warm-hearted, able to understand other people to whom fate had dealt an unkind hand. Lyndon Johnson goes all the way through pursuing power and then has a massive heart attack when he's just reached the height of power in the Senate as majority leader. And then he says to himself, what if I died now? What would I be remembered for? And then goes for civil rights in the Senate, and then that becomes his legacy in the presidency. So you could read, and then the last part is when they're in the presidency, and I've taken pivotal moments in their presidency to really look at their leadership traits and what's the family resemblance of those traits.
Another historical talking head, John Meacham, I heard him on TV at the National Book Festival, and he said that leadership needs curiosity, reason over passion, humility, empathy. What is your definition of leadership? What qualities make a leader?
Well, I would definitely say humility, which means the ability to acknowledge your errors and learn from your mistakes. These guys have to grow in office, all of them do, and that means you have to be willing to know that you have limitations. For example, Teddy Roosevelt, when he first went into the state legislature, he was so full of himself. He was yelling and screaming, pounding his desk, and after a while, he couldn't get anything done. So he said, I rose like a rocket and I fell like a rocket. But he was able to acknowledge that. I think empathy is probably one of the most important qualities, to be able to understand other people's point of view. In fact, Teddy warned, and it's so warning for today, he said the problem for democracy will be if people in other sections, other religions or races or parties begin to see each other as the other rather than as fellow citizens. And he acknowledged that when he came into politics, unlike Lincoln or unlike LBJ, coming from a much more troubled economic background, he was so privileged that when he first went into a slum, it seemed self-conscious to try and understand what it was like for those people. But then after a while through politics, he's a police commissioner. He's walking the streets at night. He's a soldier in the army. He said it becomes more natural to understand them and want to do something about them. And I think for FDR, that empathy developed in part because of the polio, because then other people to whom fate had dealt an unkind hand, as I say, he connects to them. Without empathy, I don't see how you can become a good leader.
Don't you also need, you have it right there as a chapter title, ambition? I mean, people out here think ambition is not a good thing. I think it's a very good thing in a leader.
You cannot have a success without ambition. Ambition has to be the drive for success, the willingness to work hard, to realize whatever your talents are. And all of these guys had ambition. The interesting thing, though, is at some point, if you're going to be one of the leaders that history remembers, that ambition for self has to become an ambition for the greater good. And they all, Lincoln, I think, almost had it from the beginning. I mean, that's what's incredible about him, as you know, when he's 23 years old, and he says, every man has his peculiar ambition. Mine is to be esteemed of by my fellow man, to be worthy of that esteem. I was doing an exit interview with President Obama, and I was reading him that part, and I said, what's your peculiar ambition? So he said, well, I'm not sure that I was where Lincoln was when I was 20s. It was more that I wanted to do something to prove to my vanished father, or maybe because I was in a mixed race, I wanted to show that I could be something. Only later did it get attached to politics. And I think that's true for FDR, too. He was pretty unambitious, you would think, when he was at Groton or Harvard or Columbia Law School. And then somebody comes to him and said, why don't you run in the Dutchess County seat, a safe Democratic seat? And immediately says yes. He knew something about himself, that he had a more gregarious temperament than that insulated world had allowed him to express. The minute he got out on the campaign trail, this was him. You know, it's like William James says, there's a certain moment in people's lives when the voice inside said, this is the real me. And he was great. I mean, he wasn't a good speaker at the beginning. They said he would pause between lines so much they were afraid he'd never go on, until by the end of the campaign they wanted to drag him off the stage because he was talking too long. But his gets attached to the greater good when he gets a little bit older. LBJ's when he gets older. Teddy's when he gets older. And that's what makes a real leader. But they all need that drive for success in the first place.
Did they each have a time of failure in leadership?
Absolutely. I mean, they all did. I mean, obviously, Lincoln not only fails that first time he runs for the state legislature, but he forewarns people at the end of that wonderful handbill, you know, I may try again if I lose. In fact, I've been so familiar with disappointment that I won't be very much chagrined. But he said, I may try 5 or 6 times until it gets too humiliating, and then I promise I won't try again. So yes, and then he, of course, failed 2 Senate races before he wins for the presidency. I think that in some ways, LBJ had a huge failure in 1941 when he didn't win the race for the Senate. And for him, that was a repudiation of self. So he cycled into a depression as deep as FDR with his polio or Teddy losing his wife and mother, which seems crazy, except you realize that politics was who he was. And then he went in the opposite direction because of that. He became more conservative to win the next Texan race. He undid his New Deal heritage. And only, as I say earlier, when he had that heart attack, he realized this is who I originally was. I was in this for something bigger than myself, and it became larger again.
Greatness as a president. Bill Clinton wanted to be a great president, but he didn't have a war to propel him up. Is war necessary for a leader, for a president to be known as great? I mean, you know, TR, of course, had his war on industry, but he also came in as a war president from San Juan. Do you need war to be a great president?
Well, we've got to hope not. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt himself said, if there had been no war, we wouldn't know who Lincoln was now. But I think that's wrong. I think what it means is that you need a challenge, and that if you've got a big challenge, it's easier to mobilize the country behind you. So it is often a war or a depression. Teddy had a hidden crisis in the industrial era that was not dealing fairly with most of the people, and the Gilded Age had begun with the rich and the poor, and he saw that, and he saw the need to regulate the economy and to break up the big companies. So he became one of the great leaders, even though he didn't have the war that he thought he might have. But the thing that's important is, even if you have that big challenge, you may fail at it. I mean, James Buchanan was president before Lincoln, and he escalated the problems rather than healing them. Herbert Hoover was the president before FDR, and the Depression was there. He had his chance, but he didn't have the temperament that fit that chance. I'm not sure that JFK could have gotten a civil rights bill through. He would have maybe done better with the foreign policy in Vietnam, but only Lyndon Johnson, the Southerner who knew every single congressman and what was necessary, could do that. So it gives you an opportunity if you've got a crisis that needs to be met. But you can fail at it and fail bigly, just as you can succeed largely.
Since you brought them up, I'm going to ask you, as an historian, I have a little bit of empathy for Hoover, maybe less for Buchanan, but I don't see how either of them could have stopped what was coming. And the economy, Hoover had some ideas ahead of time that weren't taken up. Whether that could have done it, there was such a massive effect that happened that I'm not sure he could have stopped it. In war, Lincoln thought that the only way slavery was going to end was through war. That's a George Robertson letter in 1856. And he had the guts to say, it's going to stop here. And that was, to me, the greatness. We're not going to get it into the territories. It's stopping right here. So I have a little bit of doubt that either of them should get the opprobrium that they do, Buchanan and Hoover.
Well, you may be not able to prevent events that are coming forward. I don't think Buchanan could have prevented the breaking up over slavery. It was inevitable what was going to happen. I mean, that's what Lincoln understood. That's what historians understand looking back. It's how you handle your time there. And he deliberately was involved in the Supreme Court decision on Dred Scott. He made the South his constituency rather than the American people as a whole. He was supposed to be the president of the people. And I think with Hoover, it wasn't so much what he could have done to stop it, but it was that when he talked to the people, he didn't get the confidence of the people that they would get through this. In fact, he kept saying, things are better, they're going to be better around the corner. And I'm not sure he ever had the experimental temperament that you would need, that FDR had from experimenting with polio so many times. How am I going to walk again? That I'll try this, if it fails, I'll try that. But he was a very good man. In fact, I've been to the Hoover Library, and you think about his whole career up to that point was extraordinary.
Yes, it was extraordinary.
But I just think that temperament, you needed that confident, optimistic temperament so that the country, after that first fireside chat and that first inaugural address, people felt different. And that's the mystery of leadership. How can that be? Somebody says something, you're still having a depression going on, but he's promising action, and he's telling you it's going to be all right, and you believe him.
No, and then it's not.
And then it's not.
Yeah. I'm going to read again from John Meacham again, that he said, intellectual dishonesty and inconsistencies are a part of politics. There was a reason why Kennedy's Profiles in Courage was just one volume. So lying in politics seems to be, he's saying, is endemic to the cause. And it's certainly endemic in vogue today. What are your thoughts? Is he correct? Did these four gentlemen ever dissemble? Did they have to go to that?
Well, lying is different from dissembling, I think. I mean, dissembling is a means to an end, and maybe you promise something to somebody and somebody else, and you bring them together, as Lincoln had to do to get the 13th Amendment passed. But that's different from outright fabrications or lying. If you don't have a sense of shared political truth in a country, I think the country loses its direction. LBJ paid consequences for not being truthful to the American people about what was happening in the war in Vietnam, and a credibility gap developed. And that's really in the sense that the bottomed out of his public support came from people not believing anymore that the war was doing as well as he was claiming it was. And then events undid him. So there used to be more consequences for lying than I think there are now. I think that's different. Mm-hmm. I think that's got to do with social media now. It's got to do with a shared, sense of people watching different stations, just reading the alternatives of what they want to, with the idea that there's alternative facts. I mean, that was true in the 1850s when you're reading the partisan newspapers, as you know. Then you might be reading about Lincoln at a Stephen Douglas debate doing great, and they carry him out on their shoulders. And in the Democratic paper, he's fallen on the floor, so they have to drag him out. But that's not a good memory, that's how divided the country was. And then for a long time, we had national newspapers, we had the national radio, we had 3 television networks, so that it was harder, I think, to not share facts in a way that it is today. I think
the other thing from Lincoln's time, there were no airplanes. And so the congressmen had to stay there and know each other. Right. Today, they're in Tuesday to Thursday and they're out. They don't know anyone else. And they don't get together and learn that the other side, all right, I don't agree with them, but it's a human being there.
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, that's not only just in Lincoln's time, in LBJ's time. In the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, they played poker together, they drank together. Many of them had been in World War II or the Korean War together, so they knew what it was like to have a common mission that took you across party lines. When he needed Everett Dirksen, the man of Illinois, to go with him on civil rights to break the Southern filibuster, they were friends. They could sit down, and here's where dissembling or making things, I'll promise you whatever you want, Everett. You want a postmastership in Peoria? You want me to come to Springfield? I'll come there, check. You want an ambassadorship? Yes. They drink and make these trades. But then he understood something about Dirksen, that he too wanted to be remembered. So he says, Everett, you come with me on this bill. You bring Republicans to break the Southern filibuster, and 200 years from now, school children will know only 2 names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. How could Dirksen resist?
I love it. It's been, you say, in fact, in this book, that you see leaders as mirrors in which the people see their collective reflection. It's controversial who uttered this thought. Every nation gets the government it deserves. So do we get the leaders we deserve? Have we historically? Does a present resident in the Oval Office, how does he reflect us and we deserve him?
Well, I think what happened in the case of candidate Trump is that he did understand something that was happening in the country. I mean, the Industrial Revolution shook up the economy much as the tech revolution and globalization have done today. There's been a gap between the rich and the poor. There have been people in rural areas in these last decades feeling left out of the country. There's been a fear of immigration, that they were scapegoating people who were taking jobs away. There was a feeling that middle-class life had passed people by. And he made that group of people feel that he was on their side. So then the question is, I mean, Teddy Roosevelt understood that same group of people when he was running, but once he became president of all the people. So he had a square deal for the rich and the poor, for the capitalist and the wage worker. And that's what you would have hoped, that when President Trump became President Trump, that you would expand the base, not simply talk to the base. Teddy used to go around the country on a train, 6 weeks in the spring, 6 weeks in the fall, and he would go to places he lost as well as places he won, and he would talk about common duties as citizens. And that sense of citizenry has to get above where we are. And I think when you look at these people who were in this book, as I say, it wasn't just the leader, it was the people and the citizens. So we've got to figure out what's going on with our primary system, what's going on with congressional districts that are so gerrymandered that people are on either the left or the right, what's going on with money in politics. We can do something about that. There could be a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. We could figure out a national service program for young kids. That I know Teddy cared about that, Eleanor cared about that. I think nothing could matter more than a domestic Peace Corps here, where you bring kids from a rural area to a city, have a host, and they're working on disaster relief. They're teaching. There's so many applicants for a teacher corps that they can't take them. But if kids had that sense of a common mission, we need this next generation to not feel the otherness that Teddy warned against. We can do these things.
We might need the coasts, the young people on the coast, to go to the middle America
and the other way
vice
around.
versa.
I couldn't agree more. What if you did that after high school for a year or two? And I don't care if it costs billions, it would be worth everything.
I have a question coming in that, strangely enough, just today, this is coming in. This is just a Xerox, color Xerox, of a Lincoln document that he signed right after the Black Hawk War, not after the Civil War. That would be something. It'd be like
It'd be
Grant's
so
memoirs.
valuable.
Yeah, Grant's memoirs signed. Well, so I don't know if you can see that A. Lincoln down here, but so why I'm showing this right now is because, of course, Lincoln went back to this moment for success and saying that of all the successes I've had being elected captain, it's better than anything I've had since. That's exactly it.
Yeah, no, I know
Gary
that.
Moore, thank you, Gary Moore, I didn't say where you were from, asked, how did Lincoln's militia leadership role in the Black Hawk War contribute to his later national leadership? And how did, not only for Lincoln, but the other three, how did their early leadership really help them when it was necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question
Thank you, Gary.
that Lincoln said, you know, that he felt by being elected captain that he had done something. It made him feel like he was a leader. And the same thing happened to Teddy Roosevelt when he was in the Spanish-American War. He said after he was there for 2 weeks, he said there were better horsemen than him, there were better people who were shots than him, there were much better bodybuilders than him, but he knew that he was their leader, and they knew it too. There's that sense when you realize you're taking the responsibility for other people and that they're accepting that responsibility. And I think to a certain extent, LBJ knew that when he was young as well, you know, and they all were storytellers. That's part of being a leader. I mean, obviously, yeah. Teddy was telling stories to his sisters and brothers because he had a great memory and he had this capacity to create stories because he read so much. And Lincoln was telling stories from the time he's 7 or 8 years old, right? And
when he's on that from his dad.
He learned that from his dad. And then when he's on the circuit in Illinois, he's the center of attention. I mean, part of it is not just that moment when you recognize you're a leader. I think they all like to be the center of attention, right? I mean, they said of Teddy that he wanted to be the baby at the baptism and the bride at the wedding and the corpse at the funeral. So he was the center of his family's attention, as was Lyndon Johnson, as was FDR, as was Teddy. But somehow Lincoln developed it by going out and becoming somebody. Even when he was a young person, he'd stand on a stump and tell stories to his fellow workers until his father came and said, "You're supposed to be working."
Let's go through some of the traits kind of quickly of for all four in this book. By the way, you can get this book and get it signed, and we'll send it to you. If you go to authorsvoice.net, if you're on that, there's a button there, and on Facebook Live, there's a button there to either give us a comment or to buy a book. And those are the four you're going to be reading about, and you're going to enjoy this book. And I think it's a good teaching tool for us today. Maybe we'll get to that in a few minutes. But let's go to your four guys. What were the essential character traits of each? Certainly energy and drive. We've talked a bit about them, but there are essential things that all four of them had in common.
Well, one of the ones that I think is most interesting is that at least 3 of the floor were able to find time to think and relax and replenish their energy, something it's so hard for us to do in our modern world with our phones and emails. Think of how busy they were. I I mean, Lincoln is worrying about a civil war, and yet he can go to the theater 100 times. He said when the lights went down and a Shakespeare play came on, for a few precious hours, he could forget the war that was raging. It's so essential, not just for leaders, for human beings to be able to relax like that. And of course, he relaxed with his sense of humor by telling a funny story, even when he couldn't sleep at night, bringing one of the Shakespeare comedies to Nicolay and Hay, his secretaries, reading it aloud so he could go back to sleep and think about something else other than the war that was raging. Teddy Roosevelt exercised for 2 hours every day. Amazingly, at the end of the White House, a boxing match, a wrestling match, or his favorite was a hike in Rock Creek Park where there was a rule you couldn't go around any obstacle. You had to go through it. So if you had a rock, you had to climb it. If you saw a precipice, you had to go down it. So people were falling by the wayside all the way along. The best stories told by the French ambassador. He came in his silk outfit. I'm going to walk with the president as if it's the Champs-Élysées. Finds himself in the woods following after him. He says, oh my God, this is awful. Finally, they get to a stream, and he thinks, thank God it's over, and we'll go back. And then, judging my horror, he says, when I saw the president unbutton his clothes and heard him say, well, this is an obstacle. We can't go around it, so we might not get our clothes wet. So he said, I too, for the honor of France, took off my apparel. However, I left on my lavender kid gloves. If we should meet ladies on the other side, it would be most embarrassing if I didn't have my gloves on. So he was able to do that. And FDR had a cocktail party every night in the White House during World War II, where the rule was you couldn't talk about the war. You could talk about gossip, you could books you'd read, movies you'd seen, just so he, for a few precious hours, could forget that war. So finding those ways to replenish energies, and sometimes to get away to think. FDR went on a 10-day fishing trip pre-World War II, when Britain was in terrible trouble, before we're in the war. He came up with the whole Lend-Lease idea while he was fishing, away from all the trouble in Washington where they couldn't figure out the answer to the problem.
It's interesting. I come to this myself because the only time of the day that I have to myself to really think is the half an hour, 40 minutes it takes to go to and from my house. And I'm in the car, I'm alone, I can think, and am alone to do that. So I think that's so important. It's
Absolutely.
We've talked a little bit about growth, and I think that's important too. You have to be able to grow. And Lincoln is famously growing in the 50s. Where did each of them have their particular growth, you think, that really developed to whom they were?
I would say for Teddy, it was the range of jobs he took, that each one was so different. I mean, what happened is, what happened with his wife and his mother was that he was in the state legislature, and his wife was about to give birth. The mother had come to take care of the wife, and he got the telegram saying a child is born. They celebrate with cigars, and then the next telegram says that your wife is dying and your mother's dying too. The mother had gotten typhoid fever. She was only 49. By the time he got home, she died, and then 12 hours later, his wife died. So when he went to the Badlands, he became much more fatalistic about life. He had thought beforehand, I'm going to move from the state legislature to the Congress, to the Senate, to the vice president, the presidency. But now he thought, I'm just going to take whatever job comes my way, because it may be my last job. So he's a civil service commissioner. People said, that's much too lowly for you. But he learned about the merit system. Then he becomes police commissioner of New York. Somebody said, why would you want that job? And then he becomes a soldier. He becomes assistant secretary of the Navy. He's governor. By the time he gets into the presidency, though he's the youngest man in the country to be president, he really felt like he'd had a wide range of experience. That's politics at its best, when it teaches you different things. You have to learn a whole new way of thinking, a whole new group of people to be with. So I think that was his greatest growth. I would say for FDR, it was at Warm Springs. There was something when he created that rehabilitation clinic for those other polio patients, and he became old Doc Roosevelt there. He showed his own vulnerabilities, but he made them feel they could have a purpose in life again. He made them feel they could be fun. They played water polo and tag. They had cocktail hours at night. They had amateur theatrics, wheelchair dances. And he learned then that extraordinary fulfillment of being able to change people's attitude toward their own lives. For LBJ, it probably was, he grew when he was young, but then he went on that downward slide, I think. But then after he realized that he wanted something to happen and he got into that presidency, he grew enormously there because he knew the Congress, and each law made him want to have the next law passed. He never stopped. He knew how to drive. He'd call them at 3 in the morning. He'd call them at midnight. He'd call them at 6 a.m. If he didn't get the congressman, he'd get the wife. If he couldn't get the wife, he'd get the kid. And each one of those experiences of getting one bill passed taught him how to get the next bill passed. And he just kept going until, of course, the war ate up all of that energy.
Well, you have everything. You also have in here a presidential philosophical family tree, where LBJ admired FDR. FDR had admired Teddy Roosevelt.
Right.
Teddy Roosevelt admired Lincoln. Lincoln had admired George Washington. I'm wondering who George Washington admired.
Yes, that's a good question.
Yeah. So it's kind
Yeah.
of interesting that they have that.
Yeah, no, it really is. And it
Intriguing.
shows how short our history is, number one.
Yeah.
But there's no question for LBJ. I mean, he had met FDR when he was a young congressman. The two of them bonded immediately. In fact, FDR said when he saw the kind of extraordinary energy that LBJ had, that maybe this would be the first Southern president, if ever there were such a guy. And then Teddy was his idol from the time he was young. And he sort of modeled his career on Teddy. But Teddy adored Lincoln. I mean, he thought about Lincoln. The summer that he had this huge coal strike, where he had to really deal with a major crisis, he read Nicolay and Hayes, 9 volumes that summer. And he would say, look, he's caught between extremes just like I am, and this is what he does, and he's able to get past resentments. I'm going to have to do that. And then, of course, Lincoln goes back to the Founding Fathers. But they all read and thought about the past. And I think the big lesson is that it's just such things that we can learn from history. And we learn from our parents and our grandparents, and of course they learn from one another. And you would hope that all the current living presidents would spend more time together, because only they can tell the next person what it's like to be president. And there is some sense we hear that Clinton and Bush have gotten to be friends, and I wish that all these guys could come back right now and become friendly with
nice,
our current president and give him a lot of lessons.
If he'd listen, that's the problem. You have to still listen.
You do.
We're each of them also a bit profane. I tell the story of LBJ and when he brought some people into his cabinet who weren't of his ilk, and people criticized him. He said, "Well, I'd rather have them inside the tent pissing out than outside pissing in." And so, and Lincoln could tell the ribald joke. Were they all a little profane at the same time?
I don't know about FDR. That's interesting. Certainly LBJ, certainly Lincoln in that sense. And it was interesting when I was interviewing Obama in those months before he left, I was telling him about Lincoln's ability to write hot letters when he was angry with somebody and get all of the anger out and then put the letter aside and then not need to send it because he had cooled down psychologically. So I said, "Do you ever do that?" And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I do it all the time." He said, "I get really angry in this job." He said, "I've sworn more in this job than I've ever in my life before." But then I write a letter to that person that I'm angry with, and I crumple it up and throw it in the wastebasket. So I'd love to find those letters in the wastebasket.
Yeah, exactly.
But they had techniques for dealing with their anger. And I think the profaneness sometimes was just a way of telling a story. It's ribald. I mean, and that's different from swearing at somebody, which LBJ did at times.
Yes, he did.
I don't see FDR doing that, or I don't see Teddy doing that, or Lincoln. I mean, remember, there's that time when he mocks that opponent when he's a young man, and the opponent, the skinning of Thomas or something,
right.
and the opponent starts crying. And then he goes to him and apologizes, and he decides, I'm never going to do this again. It's not worth making a political point to do that kind of a thing. So I think he learned from that kind of experience.
He was able to. He had a kind soul in there that we don't really always see. And with animals, the same thing.
Absolutely.
He shot one once, and he felt so badly he never would do that again. So he learned.
I mean, I think he was born with empathy. I think some of these traits are inborn, and some are developed. Most are developed. You take the talents you have, and you work hard and develop them.
Is leadership born, or is it, do you grow into it? I mean, which way is that?
It's both, but mostly you grow into it. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt wrote an essay where he said there's 2 kinds of success. One is if a person has a talent that no matter how hard you try to develop it, you can't, like a Shakespeare or a great poet. But he said most success comes from talents that you have, that you develop to an ordinary talent you have, you develop to an extraordinary degree through hard, sustained work. So there are gifts. I mean, Lincoln was born with a gift for language. Obviously, I think he was born with empathy. Teddy was born with a photographic memory and this extraordinary curiosity. FDR was so lucky to have that optimistic temperament. And LBJ just had unbelievable energy that came with him, I think. But then the talents have to be developed, and I'd weigh on that side.
Very briefly, 3 words or less.
No way!
What were the happiest times for each of them? I mean, I'm thinking, reading the book, LBJ was teaching, of all things. He may have been the happiest back in the old days in Texas teaching. And FDR, perhaps, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. What were the actual happiest time in their lives?
Well, my guess is, for Lincoln, we know that that last day of his life was one of the happiest days of his life. And he said so, you know, and they said he looked different, that there was a change in his face because he knew the war was coming to an end. He knew that emancipation was on its way. So that makes sense for him. I mean, I think for Teddy, I suspect, weirdly, that the happiest time may have been when he was in the war, given that he knew he was leading this contingent of Rough Riders. He knew he was a young leader that was making it work. And although he was a pretty happy guy much of the time, and FDR, it may well have been, he loved being Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He cared about ships his whole life. That's an interesting thought. And for LBJ, clearly it was that experience that he came back to again and again when he took a year off from college and he taught at a Mexican-American school in Cotulla, Texas, and the kids were really poor, and he saw the pain of prejudice on their face. So he became a one-man band for them. He used his money that he got his salary to buy sporting equipment. He became the band leader, the debate coach, the principal of the school, the teacher, and he just wanted to fire these kids with ambition. And the amazing thing is he came back to that later in his life when he gave the famous We Shall Overcome speech, which my husband, I'm proud to say, worked on. And in it, when he talks about what I said before, you know, no northern problem, he comes back and he said, I never knew when I stood there in 1928 and saw the pain of prejudice on those young kids' faces that someday I'd be in a position to help their sons and daughters. And I'm telling you, I have the power now. I'll let you in on a secret. I'm going to use it. So that became a lodestar for him, really, that experience of having transformed those little kids' lives, and then maybe he could do it for the country as a whole.
There's so much in this book that you will learn from, as well as have interest and curiosity for. So many things you've not really thought of that are in here and are put together with the four guys in your life. Here's something I've asked here and there, and I want to ask you. You said long ago that you fell in love with Abraham Lincoln, and maybe the others in serious like, for all you know. Daniel Day-Lewis said he'd never fallen in love with a man whom he had not met as much as he had with Lincoln. I came to this shop, and I fell in love with the guy because of whom, after I learned more about him and whom he really was, not just school stuff, I learned to live with him in love, really. He's just a fascinating guy. So what are we historians, how do we remain objective when we fall in love with the object of our curiosity?
Well, there'll always be moments, however much you love the person, where they'll disappoint you, like a person does, a friend does, where they make a decision that you may not agree with. And you have to not be able to deal with that and understand it. But there's no question that that enormous feeling that people have toward Lincoln has absolutely shaped what they write about. I mean, you can't help it. In his case, goodness is greatness, and that's not true for most leaders, right? He's a really good man and happened to become a great man. I had the feeling if I could just be more like him, you know, as if you have these emotions that he had, obviously, envy or anger or jealousy, but somehow he was able to push them down because he didn't have time for them, not let those resentments fester. That if you could just be that way and be able to whistle off sadness with humor, be able to bring people around you even if they'd hurt you and forgive them, I mean, those are human qualities that are extraordinary. And not even just in a leader. If he was an ordinary person and he was in your neighborhood, you would feel him. You'd feel who he is.
It's interesting, being like Lincoln. Lincoln College at the Lincoln Heritage Museum, their motto is, when I was there and I helped them build that museum, the motto was, learn from Lincoln, live like Lincoln.
Yeah.
And that's what I think his character is going to bring us to the tricentennial of his birth, more than slavery or keeping the Union. It's going to be his character. And I think that's something, maybe with the Political Institute that you're on the board with, David Axelrod here at the University of Chicago, in conjunction with a couple of other places here in Illinois that are using Lincoln's character to try as an exemplar for all of us. And we'll talk about that. I think there's something there for Lincoln, not just because he's here in our lives every day, but there's more for us to be better people, better citizens through him.
Without a question. I mean, the character is the most important quality we really should be looking for in a leader. I mean, you have to discern it over a period of time. Before Tim Russert died, he and I talked about the fact that when we're looking at leaders in a journalistic point of view, instead of looking at who is in some stupid debate says something interesting or sings somebody else or who's raised the most money or who promises what, we should be knowing from looking at the past What kind of leaders were they? They'd all come from somewhere usually. They'd been a congressman or a senator or a mayor or been in business somewhere else. What kind of character did they show? How did they deal with the people on their team? How did they deal with their own emotions? Were they able to contain them, or did they get angry with people? How did they communicate? Was their word to be trusted? Were they able to, to have humility and empathy? In the end, that's why that Tolstoy quote is so incredible about Lincoln. When he's talking to a New York reporter at the turn of the 20th century, and the guy says, so what made Lincoln so great after all? And he said, well, he wasn't as great a general as Napoleon, maybe not as great a statesman as Frederick the Great, but his greatness consisted in the moral fiber of his being and his character.
And that's
what
we
we're looking
need.
for.
The electorate needs that too.
Absolutely.
We as the electorate can't just put it all on our leaders. We have to ourselves learn and be a part of a democracy. That's what it is, for heaven's sakes.
Right.
And if we don't know anything, and if 56% don't vote, then it's their future that they're harming, not just
I agree.
ours.
It's a responsibility if you've got a democracy to keep it. And that's the critical thing.
So which historical figure have you not covered that you would have liked to in your past? Maybe in coming forth you might want to get involved with and go to bed with.
Well, I'm going to be working on a documentary on George Washington, about which I know very little, actually. So there'll be people who know about George Washington doing it, and I'll be a consultant on it. So I think that'll be fun to finally learn about old George. It looked like something magic was coming out from there. I thought George Washington was suddenly going to appear.
Well, I wanted to say to Samuel Black, it's a long note here, and I can't get into that right now because we have to end this, but thank you for that, and I'll share that with Doris as well. Let's see. Samuel is at the AP U.S. History class from St. Louis University High School.
Hooray!
The high school class in
Hooray.
St. Louis is watching us right now.
Oh my God, that's so
And
cool.
appreciate
Hi,
that.
so glad. That really is
They
great.
do
That's
this
the
from
best.
time to time, and
Yeah.
they send in questions sometimes, and next time do that. And I think they're going to learn
We'll
from
get to
this
him
as
first
well.
next time. That's
Exactly
a
it.
promise.
Well, I'm going to end this now. We have to get you out to the adoring public, frankly. So let me tell you that coming up on Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world, tomorrow, Halloween at 3 p.m. Central Time, October 31st, Stranger Than Fiction welcomes Robert Brueggemann with his new book, Art Deco Chicago, Designing Modern America. Truly beautiful work. And we have a new host for that. Angie Watson will be hosting that. So Stranger Than Fiction tomorrow on Designing Modern America through the Art Deco here in Chicago. Gorgeous book. You'll like seeing it just even through the camera, but you can own it and put it on your own shelf too. And then November 6th, Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. Central. All of this is on authorsvoice.net. You can go to it and see the upcoming shows on the left. We'll have our children's show, Lady Bird and Friends, November 6th, 5:30 p.m. Central. And our host, Betsy Bird, will be welcoming Anastasia Higginbotham with her latest book for grades 3 through 7. So if you have children and grandchildren whom you think this might be useful for, maybe they could even watch for a little while. But you can certainly get the book. And it's called Not My Idea. And I can't wait to see that myself, since it wasn't my idea. So that's November 6th at 5:30 p.m. Don't forget to ask questions while you're there at authorsvoice.net and order signed copies. And if you're watching on YouTube right now, after our live broadcast here, you can still order signed books by hitting the link below. Well, Doris, thank you so much
you're
for
welcome,
being
old
here,
friend.
truly. And appreciate it and can't wait for, well, maybe we'll get your documentary in here with Washington, and we'll talk about that as well. And I thank the staff at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop for helping put this on. We couldn't do it without them. And we thank all of our friends and clients who come to us and help keep us afloat by ordering books and reading them, in fact, and enjoying and wondering what else is coming. So thank you again for joining us on Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. Come back again.